All right, let's jump right into this. Today, we're digging into a concept called America's metaphysical axiom. We're going to explore a major contradiction right at the heart of the nation's founding and what it reveals about the very nature of justice.
Okay, so let's start with something we all know. These words from 1776. They're this incredible universal promise, a foundational statement about human equality. It's really the bedrock of the entire American experiment.
But then, just 14 years later, you see this. Many of the very same founders passed the Naturalization Act of 1790, and it explicitly says that to become a citizen, you had to be a free white person. All of a sudden, that universal promise doesn't sound so universal anymore, does it?
And that right there is the puzzle we're tackling. How do you square that circle? You've got this profound, beautiful statement about universal equality, followed almost immediately by a law built on racial exclusion. What on earth were they thinking? Let's try to unpack the logic here.
So, to solve this puzzle, the source material argues we have to go back to the beginning. We need to understand what the founders actually meant when they talked about equality. See, the core idea is that the phrase, all men are created equal, wasn't just, a nice suggestion. It was presented as a metaphysical axiom. And that's just a fancy way of saying it was a self-evident, foundational truth about reality itself. It's the starting point from which everything else, all political and legal thinking, is supposed to follow.
So, what kind of equality are we talking about here? The source calls it ontological equality. That means equality in our very being. The argument was that all human beings, no matter their differences, share one fundamental thing, a rational nature, an intellect, and a will. And it's that shared nature that gives every single person an equal moral standing.
Now, it is absolutely crucial to understand what this idea of equality wasn't. It wasn't about everyone having the same talents or the same abilities or getting the same results in life. The point they were making was much deeper, that underneath all our differences, we all share the same essential human dignity, which gives us an equal moral standing before the law.
Okay, so with that specific understanding of the axiom in our heads, let's look at that 1790 law again. Now we can see why the source argues it's a direct violation of this core founding principle.
And here's where it all breaks down. The law made citizenship dependent on race, which in philosophical terms is just an accidental characteristic, something non-essential. By focusing on that, it completely ignored the essential characteristic that the Declaration was all about, our shared human nature.
So why did they do it? The source argues this wasn't just simple hypocrisy. It was actually the result of a huge philosophical battle that was raging at the time between two totally different ideas about reason itself.
It kind of boils down to this, on one side. You had a school of thought called Scottish realism, which said that reason discovers truth that are already out there, like our shared humanity. That's the thinking that shaped the Declaration. But on the other side, you had the continental method, which saw reason as a tool to construct new systems. And those systems could, in theory, be used to justify hierarchies and ignore common sense.
And believe me, this isn't just some abstract theory. Get this quote from David Hume, a huge figure in the Continental Enlightenment. He's literally using his philosophical reasoning to suspect a natural inferiority based on race. It shows exactly how this way of thinking could be used to build a racial hierarchy.
And it wasn't an isolated idea. Here's another one, this time from the massively influential philosopher Immanuel Kant, making this incredibly sweeping and, frankly, ugly claim. The source argues it's precisely this kind of system-building reason that infected the 1790 law and put it in direct opposition to America's own core axiom.
So we have this founding principle on one hand, and a law that just completely contradicts it on the other. How do we judge which is right? Well, the source turns to a classic framework from natural law theory that gives us a really clear standard for what makes a law just in the first place.
According to the philosopher Thomas Aquinas, law works on two levels. First, you have the universal principle, which comes from natural law, something like human equality. Then, lawmakers are supposed to create a specific determination. That's the actual human-made law that applies that big principle to a real-world situation, like, say, setting rules for residency or a voting age. And here's the key. A human-made law is only considered just if its specific rule is faithful to that universal principle. If the specific law ends up contradicting the very truth it's supposed to be upholding, well, then that law is fundamentally unjust. And this leads to a really powerful conclusion from Aquinas. An unjust law isn't just a bad law or a mistake. He calls it a perversion of law. So from this point of view, the 1790 Naturalization Act wasn't just a poor application of the founding principle. It was a corruption of the very idea of what law is supposed to be.
So, what's the big takeaway from all of this? Why does diving into this historical and philosophical framework still matter for us today?
Well, let's just quickly recap the main argument. First, America's founding is based on this powerful metaphysical axiom of universal human equality. Second, those early laws that restricted rights based on race weren't just hypocritical. By the founders' own philosophical logic, they were illegitimate perversions of law. And third, this natural law framework gives us a fixed, timeless standard we can use to judge any law, past or present. And this is really the most powerful idea from the source. The promise in the Declaration isn't some dusty historical artifact that we have to awkwardly explain away. No, it's the permanent measuring stick. It is the very tool we need to identify the nation's past failures and to hold all of our future laws accountable.
And that leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. The source argues that America's founding axiom provides a fixed standard. So if we accept that, if a nation's laws really must be judged against its own founding truths, what does that mean for us, right now? What is the ultimate standard for justice that we should be using in our civic life today?